Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Townsend Center, to the first of our book chats for the fall semester. I'm Stephen Best, the director of the Townsend Center for the Humanities, and I'm very pleased to welcome two of my colleagues from the English department, Tom Farber and John Shoptaw, to discuss Tom's recent book, Penultimates, The Now and the Not Yet. Tom is emeritus professor of creative writing in the English department. John, you're not emeritus.
I'm unemeritus.
You're not emeritus. Yes. John is still in the trenches. And John is also the author of a recent book called Near Earth Objects, a collection of eco-poems.
That's a thing.
Did you bring more of these for us to share?
What's that?
Did you bring more of these?
I did. I have postcards where
Okay,
you
he can share postcards with
more
you
about it.
Before the end of at the end of the event. So before I turn things over to Tom and John, I wanted to draw your attention to a few upcoming Townsend events. This semester, the center is hosting a collaborative research seminar called Rethinking Futures, which is being led by our colleagues Lila Belint of German and Andy Schenken of Architecture. And they've invited Eva Horn, a professor at the University of Vienna and founder of the Vienna Anthropocene Network, to deliver a public lecture. Her talk, A Sense of Air for an Aesthesis of Climate, will take place in this room on Monday, October 7th at 5. And then our next book chat will take place on Wednesday, October 9th, when we'll be joined by David Bates, a professor in the Department of Rhetoric. And David will be here to discuss his new book, An Artificial History of Natural Intelligence, and he'll be in conversation with our colleague Vicky Kahn, also of the English department. So to give Tom and John as much time to dive into Penultimates, I'll hand the mic figuratively over to the two of you. So I yield the floor to you, John and Tom. Thanks.
Thank you. You can always do that Stephen Colbert handoff, which is always fictional. Well, I'm the interlocutor, and I'm happy to be here. Having recently become a reader of Penultimates, which is a truly thought-provoking book. And one way I had of as I was going through, I got right away. This book was about death, but a death. To adapt a song title is a many-splendored thing. Yes, yeah, a lot of dark humor around death, and I kept going back to the word from the Christian tradition, eschatology, which is sort of the study of last things, the end of the world, the last judgment. Resurrection of the body, and then it gets adapted at the individual level of death, and thinking about the afterlife and judgment. And I felt like I wanted to secularize it and just what all those words might mean at the secular level, and that helped me sort of kind of gather these chapters. The ones that I could, and put my arms around paradise to gather the paradise of this book. I thought we might start with something that Tom knows better than I do, and maybe better than anyone in this room. The sea, especially the shore of the sea, because Tom has been a lifelong surfer. And I got to thinking about how it comes up in this book, which is not a surfing book, but the seaside, the beach is this liminal space. It's a border. And, one can surf the sea, one can sail the sea. We don't live there. We don't live there. We live on land. So so the beach is a kind of border between life and death, and waves coming in are significant for us. Whitman, at the end of Out of the Cradle, when he's been addressing a mockingbird, turns to the sea for a further clue. The sea is this extra thing, and the sea whispers the secret word to Walt and the early childhood Walt on Long Island. That word was death. He does it in a pentameter: death, 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 sort of like the never out of Lear. So with that, I thought we might start early on in this book. Tom, if you would read a little passage, wonderful passage by someone else, and you can tell us who this person is. This is in a chapter called Wavelengths.
Well, there's an Australian surfer named Dave Rostrovich, middle-aged, very blue-eyed, very good soul. He retired from competitive surfing in order to promote environmental issues. But in a film he made, a documentary about him, he talks about waves and his reading of them. And he writes, I don't want to get too esoteric when I'm talking about the surfing experience. The idea that wavelengths stop and the energy of a wave that's traveled, that started perhaps in solar wind between the sun and earth, and then created pressure above our atmosphere, and then moved through the upper atmosphere down to create downward pressure, which makes the wind, which the wind then makes enough pressure to create waves. And then we ride these waves, and that it all stops there. Well, that's not something that everyone thinks happens, that the wave and the energy of the wave stops at the shoreline. Well, this riff he made about waves and energy caught my attention because for years, as a passionate surfer, I assumed that when the waves hit the beach, that was the end of their energy, even though there were kids who could then surf the outgoing wave, going back right out. But even so, if asked, I would have said the energy stops there. So Dave Rostrovich's words registered on me because I thought, why did I assume how anything finally expires? What did I know about grieving the loss of others? Or what did I know anticipatorily or prematurely about grieving the loss of my own? So that's where that began. Yeah.
One thing I did not want to lose sight of in a discussion of this book is in the subject matter, to lose sight of the fact that it's artistically constructed and composed, and these are bordering on poems. This book is about the size of a poetry book, and it's composed often of chapters that are only a page or two long, and between prose paragraphs, there's not an indentation, but a space like a stanza break. And as I tell my students in poetry writing class, that stanzas let you jump. I compared it to Chutes and Ladders, the game. You may remember. Some of my students are scratching their heads when I say that. But so I think one thing, if you're writing a book on death and you're writing these little works, one thing that gets raised in prominence is closure. The end. That's the end of the wave of that poem. Do you see what I mean? So I was paying very close attention to the various ways, often surprising and poetic, and this is the poetic dimension of one of the poetic dimensions of your work, Tom. So just as a specimen chapter, I chose a chapter called Umpteenth. That must be an Americanism, umpteenth. looking short for somteenth, I'm
Yeah,
guessing.
Here it is.
But this is on page 22, and it begins with talking about the history of Tom getting to know the East Bay. So it begins with an opening, like the first time at the Bay, and then moving quickly to the present from the air. And then we have, we touch down, and in the poem that is, the next stanza jumps from the plane, not the SFO, but we're on the beach. And then the next one jumps to pelicans. And then you say, okay, we have arrived. And then the next one is say, but, in lyric fashion, this is not an environmental book. This is a lyrical book. It means, what are they to me? And Tom asked that question, what are they to me? And then he kind of steps back and says, well, but is that all? Is that all they are to me? And we have this paragraph. I'll let you maybe speak of it. It starts, meanwhile, this is on page 23 of the book.
Meanwhile,
But I want to say one more thing.
Yeah.
Because then at the end of this section, you're thinking how it's going to end. It's going to end with the pelicans flying off and disappearing into the sunset, like the Windhover, in an earlier William Cullen Bryant poem, you may know. But no, it ends with an orange cat, which I think is probably a tabby, but an orange cat. So that was, first I want to praise the surprise ending. And I wonder if you had any thoughts about why moving, down to the pelicans, you looking up at the pelicans, how did you get to the cat? And
about form, literary forms.
yeah,
I've never thought about genre. I've always thought that genre was a marketing consideration. So that really early on, let's say in a book I wrote about, a book of stories about men and women, I wrote my third book, Who Wrote the Book of Love. They were untitled, they were short, they were fable-like. They weren't at all like New Yorker stories back in the 1970s. I didn't have a theory about form. I just knew I was trying to write what seemed true to me. So ever since then, I felt free to go where I felt I had to go as a writer. When I wrote a book about being a writer in my 30s called Compared to What, again, the sections were untitled. They moved all over the place because I was trying to get at how I saw the role of being a writer in our culture. So in writing this book I don't feel this book is about death. I think the book is about aging, moving toward death. Peter Sheldall, if that's how you say his name, the late critic at the New Yorker, the art critic, he said, death is more like painting than sculpture because you only see one side of it, which I thought was a great observation. So part of what I've been doing in writing about older age, really the last 4 books, a book called Brief Nudity, a book called Here and Gone, Acting My Age, and now Penultimates. I've been trying to look at aging any way I can, and then often to respond to what people like a talented person like Peter Sheldall said, that wonderful notion. So here I am at the Bay once again. I went to San Francisco Bay for the first time 60 years ago, down to the marina. And eventually I had an ocean-going trimaran. And it was homemade, and it took a lot of endless maintenance. So I got to know the Bay very well. So in this piece, I'm back at the bay 60 years later. So I have a lot of memory. And I'm talking about seeing the pelicans and how powerfully they had registered on me. I'd be out there sailing in strong winds on the bay, and a flock of pelicans would go over, and it was miraculous, you know. So I wrote here, meanwhile, what don't you see when you see these living dinosaurs? What don't you see? Pelicans hunted for feathers and eggs, shot and killed as perceived competitors, harassed, culled, trapped in fishing lines, swallowing fish hooks, almost extinct in the 1970s as pesticides weakened eggshells. Extinction, Adam Phillips wrote, is the death of deaths. The death of deaths. Habitat destruction, oil spills, human overfishing, threatening food sources. Recently in California, starving pelicans were in all the wrong places, even on the freeway. Question. So what did the book of Genesis bestow on humankind? Answer. Dominion. Dominion, dominus, Latin, Lord and Master. As for this morning at the bay, 3, then 5, then 20 pelicans coming in from the north, in and then passing out of my sight, vanishing south as I squint and refocus, squint and refocus. Oh, cataracts. Walking back to the car, keeping a weather eye out for humans, given all the break-ins down here lately. Up ahead, there's a man with an orange cat trotting, dog-like, behind him. This is something I don't remember witnessing, though years ago, the woman I lived with then had 3 cats, creatures I came to know very well. When I ask him, the man explains, I have 10 rescue kittens saved from coyotes in the hills. The orange cat, not pterodactylic, but still, I remind myself, a marvel. Latin, mirabilis, strange, singular, from mirare, to wonder at.
Thank you very much. And so this is one of the ways that I feel Tom extends the meaning of eschatology. So in our world, it's not just the death of the world, but the death of, or the death is a single pelican, but the death of a species.
Yeah.
So extinction, if you see what I'm getting at in this larger secular meaning of eschatology, is part of what death is in this extended sense. Tom, you're right, though, that we can't really think about death if we don't believe in something beyond it. I think that was part of the wave quote that I was interested in. He said, well, not everyone's going to like this idea. The waves get to the end and that's the end. Because it's inconceivable, absolute ending. If you ask yourself about the beginning of the universe, you say, well, it was a big bang. You said, no. How did time and space begin? We can't really conceive that. And the same thing at the personal level. If we don't have an afterlife.
As the poet Mark Strand wrote, in a world without heaven, all is farewell. Farewell no matter what.
Yeah, that's right. So the next place, and I think it gets, maybe I'll follow up on the one word you read here, the word cataracts. And just thinking about getting older, as you mentioned, as being, a subject that we get to know better than we want to. But I was interested in the chapter pro-choice and the idea. In older, it's one of the places where you get personal and you talk about, and you can feel free to bring your maladies up, but there they are. So Tom is not just a philosopher, but understands how it pertains to him. But what is the choice in here in being pro-choice?
Well, there's this wonderful book by a person, a judge named Richard Posner. He was a very famous federal judge and prolific writer about everything. So in his 50s, Richard Posner wrote a book called Aging and Old Age. It was clear from that book that he was a person who didn't like the idea of old age. He didn't want to get old. He was afraid of it, all of the above. So what he did in this book written in his mid-50s is talk about the marginal utilities and the marginal disutilities of getting old, and what those increments would look like, and what the decisive factors would be toward what? Toward deciding to live? Was that part of where he was going? So in the vast amount of reading, the obsessive reading I did about aging, I'm still doing it, it's my nature to try to inform myself and respond. So I much admire Richard Posner, what he was doing in his book. So then, of course, I get curious what happened to Richard Posner. And he's weighed carefully the marginal utilities and the disutilities of aspects of aging. But then in his late 70s, he retires from the federal judiciary. I don't think there's an age limit, so he could have continued.
Alas.
And yes, and so I wrote, this reader admires how thoughtfully and skillfully a middle-aged jurist examined the social and personal benefits and costs of old age. And of course, one can only wonder how Judge Posner confronted his own fate, how he made crucial penultimate decisions, because he wrote, I dread old age as much as the next person. Well, it turns out that in his late 70s, he not only retired, but he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And at present, he resides in a housing facility. I finished that chapter with this. About cognitive aging and frequent slippage of memory in the old. According to Dan Blazer, a doctor, he wrote, they forget. Sometimes they remember they've forgotten, and then they eventually remember what they have forgotten, until, of course, they can't, and they don't. So why am I cheered by writing about Richard Posner? I'm cheered because he took it seriously. He tried to look at it as hard as he could. He made the case for all kinds of eventualities, but then he was kind of swallowed up himself. And so I don't have a moral to draw from it, except I admire what he was trying to come to terms with. My book, I don't think, is about death. My book is about old age, older age, and between then and death. I'm not, death per se doesn't, I don't have an opinion about it. My father was a very great physician, built the first hospital in the world for the care of children with cancer. I never heard him talk about an afterlife, nor did I hear my poet mother, who wrote many books, talk about an afterlife. But I know that they were both having to deal constantly with people facing older age or facing the end. And that's what I'm trying to do.
One thing I would say about this chapter, and I want to introduce a word which you interestingly did not mention, although it shows up elsewhere in this book, is suicide.
Oh,
Suicide.
yeah, I've heard of it.
And for me, again, this is a secularization of eschatology, where, you know, in eschatology, it's God who makes the final judgment. But here, toward the end of the life, the person makes a final judgment. And part of it is life worth living? Does life living still have meaning? You know, that's why Camus said, the only serious philosophical question is suicide. That's Camus, and I think that's what he was getting at. And it's partly, let's say, saved or damned. You look at your life and you say, yes, I had a good life. Yes, I had a happy life. Yes, I can feel good about my life. Do you see what I mean? You judge yourself. You because there's not a God who judge for you. You judge yourself, and that's part of why I liked this chapter. You mentioned Hemingway. In that chapter, that's Hemingway's suicide, and you talk about self-determined death. This is, peculiar kind of death. This is not, you know what I mean? It's not. We're not talking about like a guillotine death. This is a different, more calculated, often more successful deaths. And it's interesting that Posner was calculating. He said, I don't want to go further down, but when should I, if I should end my life, and then you could say he waited too long, or you could say, if you've seen the movie Charlie, he's happy, he's okay. That's what we tell ourselves. Another dimension, before I get to the afterlife, which is coming, but another dimension of this, and talking about the end of the world, is, and this is very pertinent and I hope relevant, and maybe I shouldn't bring it up here of all places, but it's in Tom's book, so here I come, is end of the world means partly end of the nation or death of a nation. I'm going back, thinking back to D.W. Griffith's racist masterpiece, Birth of a Nation. And of course, I'm thinking about Donald Trump and the kind of apocalyptic specter he represents. Biden spoke of, not for nothing, fighting for the soul of the nation. Do you see what I'm getting at? Trying to make this larger secular understanding of eschatology. So I guess my one way of thinking about the question, and I will just mention a poem late in the day, which this chapter, which talks about someone Tom meets on this liminal space of the beach who's a QAnon advocate. So that now we know folds into Trump. But the chapter I'm looking at is called Shape Shiftings. I think of metamorphoses. How is Trump, here's my question, how is Trump connected with decomposition? Because you start with Donald Trump and you move to one way of thinking about death itself. It's decomposition.
So this book was written, it was published in January this year, but it was completed by the end of 2022. So that's kind of a dark time for all of us, COVID and so on. In Acting My Age, the book that came out 2 years before Penultimates, this book, Acting My Age, I have a section on Donald Trump, and I don't wish him ill directly, but I have a vision of him in Acting My Age, where he's on a beach in Hawaii, the kind of beach I know well, and he's all alone. This man who's never alone, and he has no retainers, and he has no phone. And in my vision, he's standing on the shore, looking out at the inhuman vast. He's wearing a full wetsuit in my vision. He's got a wetsuit cap on. He's got goggles on his forehead. No American flag lapel pin, no phone, no retainers. In that piece, what I'm imagining is Donald Trump facing his ultimates, as people often do. in my piece, I have him, he shits himself. He shits himself in his full wetsuit that he's wearing. I leave him there because for all I know, a band of heavenly angels will come and hundreds of retainers and so on, and he'll be saved again. But in Penultimates, I feel compelled to return to Donald Trump again. And these are just one of many chapters. And in Penultimates, I imagine he was so impressed with the funeral of George W. Bush. He wanted to be there at the Capitol Rotunda, right? So I imagine that the preparations he's made for his finale as an ex-president will be that he'll decompose publicly. So I imagine how that will go because, of course, the beneficiaries of his estate can make money by selling the rights to Fox News. And this will go on for days because decomposition in nature takes a while. And so I trace the steps of that progress. And what's finally left at the end of that decomposition, well, what is left? You know, when someone decomposes, there's bones and some hair. What kind of hair? Is that authentic hair? And so on. So I guess I'm not trying to wish someone ill, but I'm trying to think that everyone has an end, including people who act as if they don't have an end in sight. I guess that's my point. There's something about him that doesn't seem prone to changing his ways.
So there's one thing that happens at the end, and I'll just mention, but before I move on to the place I want to go, the afterlife is part of the afterlife here. The commercial afterlife is relics that you sell things. And I was struck, you know, after this book, we had an assassination in which Trump went down and Trump got up.
Yes.
And he is now selling parts of that suit. And I think he's maybe selling them with Bibles. I can't remember. But actually, literally, he's made relics out of that suit of his near assassination. So I was just struck at how you can just see he must have read this somehow. He must have known. But I want to, and let's leave Donald Trump, but next time you're in a bookstore or whatever, look at the latest cover of Atlantic Monthly, and you'll see how dark and apocalyptic Trump is. But the chapter Hocus Pocus has to do with a secular form of the afterlife, which at least writers understand very well. I'm sure, which includes many of you, which is books or other kinds of artifacts, maybe films or pieces of music. And you bring up Cocteau, and the second paragraph there, when Cocteau writes, it's a quote beginning, "You read." It's on page 43.
Thank you.
Because I thought Cocteau was getting at the immortality of a book. You remember those collections called Immortal Poems?
Yeah.
Remember that? Yeah, kind of what I'm thinking
Cocteau, he wrote about, he was a friend of Marcel Proust. And Cocteau writes about going to Proust's apartment after Proust died, just after. And many times Proust had read from a pile of manuscripts, sections of his great work, right? And Cocteau said that when he saw the pile of manuscripts, he felt that Proust was still alive, which is kind of a sweet notion. But Proust is talking about if you come across one of his books and you read it, you may reincarnate the dead writer and start talking like him and thinking like him, which is, again, a kind of a sweet notion about the power of art, or the afterlife of art.
Well, the sweet as in the sweet hereafter.
Mm.
And what's interesting about it is it's not just the archive, it's the reader. You need the work to be reborn in an actual physical reader who thinks about and feels the work. And then it gets to come alive again. Everything's saved now. So immortality is trivial. You see what I mean? It's all archived, but how do you access it? Who accesses it? And what do they do with it? That for me is what Cocteau already knew. What Cocteau already knew. And you know yourself, I mean, you said sweet a couple of times, as in the sweet hereafter, but later in a chapter called A Brief Eruption, you know, you go to address the reader. You say, dear reader.
Yeah.
That's a kind of eruption there, or interruption, in that, you know, kind of impossible way that you break the, you know, John Stuart Mill frame of a work, and you look over the fourth wall, you look out and you can just address the reader, you know, or Shakespeare at the end of the Tempest, dress Shakespeare, the audience. So it's here, and you know, Tom at various points will talk about a number of books he has written and passing judgment on himself that, well, that wasn't bad. That wasn't bad, and seeing other people who have a number of them. And the word prolific, I think, comes into play. The word hocus pocus, by the way, the name of this chapter, you may know the possible etymology of that term. It's like a kind of a faux Latin, but it goes back to the Last Supper when Jesus says, "This is my body." So that's hoc est corpus meum. So you can hear hocus pocus out of that. And it's and the hocus pocus, or the magic, is transubstantiation. Transubstantiation, that's what Cocteau said when he entered that room. He said, here's the Eucharist, here's the wafers. So again, if you see what I'm doing I'm just trying to secularize all these ideas, but they're all here. They're all here.
Yeah,
And
my own view, though, John,
yeah,
is I don't think about books in that way.
yeah,
It's odd. Neither of my parents ever spoke about the afterlife that I can remember. I don't think it was an issue for them.
yeah,
And even though there's a hospital with my father's name on it, you know, he died in 1973.
yes,
And even though my mother published 30-something books and they're still around, I don't think of the fate of my books in that way. That even though I know it, I'm writing them for now. I'm writing them because I need to write them and to understand what it is that I'm dealing with. There are writers like William Carlos Williams who wrote that in his old age, he meant in his early 70s, he had delivered 3,000 babies, I think. He was a doctor. But he wrote that in his old age, since public career was over and sex for him was over, that now he could write and leave something for the young. Well, that's an interesting idea, to assume that that will be how things go. There are so many books, right? And even though we know that Gilgamesh, is that how you say that?
that's how I say it.
Gilgamesh is 4,000 years old or something, you know, and we read it. I don't count on books to have immortality. That's not why I'm doing them.
No.
But I'm happy if others see them that way. Yeah. John, should we ask if there are any questions?
Well, I wanted to mention sort of one more thing, and then break for questions. Well, first, William Carlos Williams, at the end of his life, the end of his writing life was the beginning of the life of the Beats. And New Jersey poet Allen Ginsberg got William Carlos Williams to write the introduction to Howl. So he rode that wave. He rode the wave of the Beats and found a new generation of readers. So I would add that, and I'll say we don't have time, but one of the great triumphs for me of this book is you writing about your friend Brad. Brad was, among other things, a house builder, and he would build a home, he would renovate it, and then pass it along, and then build another home. And Carol, who was also, his wife was also a painter. And so he would move that way. Think of the Oliver and Wendell Holmes poem about the chamber nautilus, build thee more stately mansions, oh my soul. You feel him, Brad, doing that. And then at the end, there's a wonderful moment where Tom is writing on a desk made from a redwood burl that Brad had gathered from the mouth of the Russian River. If you can't see something beyond death in that at the mouth of the river, then, and this is at Jenner, by the way, so many of you would know Jenner. But yeah, let's open up for questions. So yeah, writers say all sorts of things about their books, but I look at what the book does, and this is what the book does and does for me. So
Are there any questions? If not, we'll keep talking. Yeah.
oh no, I want to. Let's give them time. Do you have any thoughts about? I mean, here you have someone who's thought about not death, but the impossibility of thinking about death, you might say.
Yeah.
Coming to
And
you.
you've got a mic coming over.
You write about Ernest Becker and the denial of death and hope not to deny death. What do you think now?
So the goal of this book, I said in the introduction, was quoting Ernest Becker, who and his beautiful book, The Denial of Death. Becker said that a lot of what people do is shaped by a denial of death. I don't think I believe that as completely as Becker did, in the sense that the young, when I was just crossing the campus, coming from Euclid to here, I don't think those young people were thinking about death. I would like to ask them what they are thinking about, but and nor should they be. But Becker's argument was that a lot of what people do is a denial of death. And so in the introduction to this book, I said, okay, what I want to do is to see if I can write this book and not deny death. And in the end, I don't think I deny death, but I come as close to looking at the end of life as I can. And right now, of course, for me, as for so many people, people I know are in jeopardy, people I know are trapped, and so on. We all know that. We're not kidding ourselves about any of that. So in this book, I try to take a look at our situation as I see it, and I draw on all of the reading I've done and the writers I've known and the humans I know to try to respond to those words or those situations and see if it empowers others. In Latin, there's a phrase, vade mecum. Vade mecum means, go with me. And so really penultimates for those of us in a certain age group, I think, is an invitation to come along and see what I made of what I learned and what I saw, and most of all, what I felt. Yeah. Yes. Helen, yes.
Oh, I thought that more when I was young, but I thought about it all the time. And
Could you use the mic so everyone can
sure,
hear you?
but maybe they don't want to. So anyway, and in the Katha Upanishad, Nachiketa goes to the underworld to wrest an answer to, to the problem of death from, I guess, death. And he's a young man.
Yes,
And Michael Nagler, who I studied that work with, said that that wasn't accidental, that the energy of youth is called upon to tackle these problems. At this point, I think unless we're confronting the death of people we know, at least I I think more about age, like you're doing in your book, and change, those changes. And yeah, basically, I just think, and also I think where individuals are temperamentally inclined to think about, to consider and brood and look for answers to this more or less.
yeah.
So.
One of the things I write about is that the Buddha, Siddhartha, when he's a young prince, right? And he wants to know what's in the outside world, but he's in his 20s. He's married, he has a kid, he's a prince, he's got courtesans, and he goes out into the outer world for the first time, out of the royal compound, and he sees death and old age and illness, right? And that changes him. And that story has always interested me because my sense of the Boston I grew up in the late 40s and the early 1950s, it was a dying city. And everywhere there were cripples and hunchbacks and war veterans and the poor. And then, of course, there were all of the terrible, incessant hierarchies and discriminations. So that my feeling was when I was young that, though I didn't have the words for it then, that Boston was on a death trip. It's funny because my father there was building a hospital for the care of children with cancer, though those children kept dying for many years. And when I was 20, I had a summer job that brought me here to Berkeley. And two things are odd about that. One is that I thought there was no death in California. I really did. It was incredible how different the Bay Area was in 1964. Marin County was like paradise. But also the job I had that summer was working for a wonderful doctor in the public health department here, Lester Breslow. And my job with my friend Peter Udidia was to go around and interview people who had lost a family member in the previous 12 months and to see what the medical costs had been for them. So that even though I was doing that and talking to these people who had lost a family member, still for me, there was no death in California. Well, things are different now.
Yeah, and I think we had another question here. So yes, Anna, is the mic on?
Should be.
Okay.
I'll hire too.
I want to thank you for this incredible conversation. I'm of a certain age, actually older than you, Tom, from what you've said. And when I was younger, a young adult, I was very conscious of death and led a very counterphobic life of adventure and risk because I was afraid of death. Now that I am closer to death, much closer to actual death, I have a very different experience of life. And that is, I feel wiser, and I feel that life is more valuable, and I am less of a risk taker than I was. Death has made me a better person. My consciousness of death, my awareness of death has made me a better person in that I am more concerned with the world, more concerned with the nature of life. So death, in a sense, has been a kind of a resurrection for me, speaking to your notion of the secularization
That's right, yeah.
of religion. And in some sense, I don't know when it will happen, of course, I am very grateful for this phase of life.
Yes.
Which, I mean, I had a wonderful life before being counterphobic,
Uh-huh.
but I am very grateful for the kind of distance on experience that I have now, so that I can have an actual relationship to it,
Yes.
because you need to have a relationship with the other to have that
Yes.
sense of wisdom.
Yes.
So I wondered whether that was part of what you were writing about, and I haven't read your book, but I'm going to, that notion that death actually can be, that you can be grateful for its existence.
I think your sense of awe, AWE, your sense of awe can increase in this stage of life, and also your sense of gratitude, and also your sense of the miraculous. Well, I last taught for the last time last year in graduate seminar, and you know, it was marvelous to be engaged in the lives of other people in that way. People who are trying to describe what their lives were, what their loves were, what their fears were, and to share that experience. And I would say that that sense of appreciation of the ordinary, what could be more ordinary than a seminar at UC Berkeley? But my sense of the of savoring it, because time is foreshortened, and also I came to see the students as archetypical. They've all the things that they're dealing with in their writing are things that people have been dealing with a long time, and they don't need to feel that in the way that I feel it. That is, for them, it's okay, as far as I'm concerned, that for them, it's the first time to try to tell such a story. But for me, of course, now at this stage of life, there's another dimension of feeling for them, for their joys or for their quandaries, which is that these are archetypes of human experience that people go through. So in that sense, I would say my life only gets richer. And that's not to discount the hassles, yeah, or the fears.
Here's a question, maybe final question.
I have a question in relation to Hermann Hesse Siddhartha and what you said about that book, Siddhartha.
Which book?
Siddhartha, you mentioned Hermann Hesse's
Yes.
Siddhartha. Yeah, because I enjoyed that book too, you know, when I was a student, and it was a sort of like leitmotif of the young generation of the 70s, 80s. At a certain time, it's like experiences, different kind of words or models, you know, of the community, of how a community can live together in a kind of perfection. And he scattered all of them till he could find a kind of peace, listening, you know, to the music of the river. So, I mean, his solution, you know, to experience death or the fear of death is more a kind of, I would say, acceptance of the absence of perfection in life. That you just need to be one with nature and let it flow, and without wondering what it will come. That's my way of interpreting the end of Siddhartha. So it's not like scattering, you know, or in the sense coming to terms with the idea of death. It's just accepting the idea of not questioning it, because we are all mortals. It's more a problem of how you deal, you know, probably with your own body or mind, which is certainly changing and not being the same.
Yeah.
You know, I'm now 60. I can't do the things I love to do at 15, but I enjoy my life because I can do things that at that time I was afraid of, or I was like totally, you know, full of inhibitions. So in the sense, age might be a wise age, full of richness. From other writers, it isn't. You know, there was a poet, he died in 2004, who was a professor at UC Berkeley, and he wrote the collection of poems, is Tom Gunn, Post-Cupid, about aging. And for him, age is nothing good. You know, it's like he was totally shocked by the idea of getting old. It was something he couldn't come to terms. So it wasn't like the,
Yeah.
so that's, I mean, it was just an observation of Siddhartha. So I wanted to know what you think about it.
Thank you. The two things come to mind. One is that at this age now, I don't feel people can be other than they are. When I grew up in Boston, everyone was supposed to improve themselves. The culture was built on the notion you could improve yourself and should. Now, in a funny way, I've come to feel, it's not an argument, I just feel that people can't help being what they are. You can support the people you want to support, you can avoid the people you don't, and so on. But for me, that's a new idea, and I think it has something to do with it being at this stage of life. Also that people, one often recognizes quickly their qualities that you might not have noticed before. The other thing is, because I have a friend who's been in terrible health, but has handled it very bravely and without complaint. So when I saw him recently for the first time in a while, he mildly observed that he didn't understand why people complain so much. And I found that remarkable. That is, that a lot of what's available to people in older age is a kind of quiet choice about how to be within the boundaries of suffering. And my friend was mildly observing that he didn't understand why people complain so much. And that was something I have to keep in mind myself. Well, I think we come to the end of our journey. Yeah, thank you so much for coming. I'll be here to talk to anybody who wants. And thank you, Stephen. Yeah. Thank you all. Yeah. Thank you, John.